The last thing I want to do this week as part of this sort of big picturing of informative speaking, developing your informative speech for this class, is to think through goals, informative speech goals. So I like starting this type of talk with a quotation. This is from Balthazar Gracian. He was a medieval rhetorician. And he wrote, "A speech is like a feast at which the dishes are made to please the guests and not the cooks." Okay? Because that gets down to what the speech is and what it's for. It's for the audience. You're doing it, but you're doing a speech for that audience. So what I want to do in this video is just talk a little bit about writing speech goals, talk about how you would evaluate those speech goals, and then finally using these goals as part of your speech preparation process. So to begin with, speech goals are there to help you think through that speech, what you want to get out of it. So as speakers, we want audience effect. Okay? We want our audience to have something, get something out of that presentation. So in that sense, a speech isn't about what you want to say, it's about what the audience needs to understand. And that sounds like such a minor distinction, but it's fairly significant. And it comes down to your presentation is about what that audience is getting from it, what that audience is taking away from it. Speech goals help you to avoid rattling on. Your job is to convey information in a way that the audience can understand. But I would distinguish sort of these sort of audience-centered goals from content goals, being audience-centered versus being content-centered. Audience-centered, my concern is with what does the audience need to hear? What do they need to know? What do they need to understand? And how can I give them that in a way that's true to me as a speaker and true to the content? Okay, that's a puzzle. As opposed to being simply content-focused, which is merely being wrapped up in one's own head. Here's what I know about this one topic, and I'm going to deliver it. Let me give you a story here. So I had a friend who went to Princeton Seminary, and he'd tell this story, and as a student, he would go into this big lecture hall. And there was a teacher there who taught there for, 1,000 years. And for each lecture, the teacher would come in with this book that he had written, wham, hit it on the, on the lectern, open up the book to the chapter that was assigned for that day, and begin reading. Read, 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 read. Bell would sound, book would close, class dismissed. That sounds awful. And of course, that's about the content. It was, this day I shall say these things. There was no concern with audience there whatsoever. People could fall asleep, and they were falling asleep. They could get up and leave. They could be now in this era. They could be texting. They could do anything. And the speaker would continue to read on. That's not what you want. That's simply focusing the book, your notes. They're not the audience, right? They're not the one who's going to be clapping at the end. You want to make sure that it's about conveying that content to that audience, meeting that audience halfway, working with them so that you're giving that audience something and they're getting something out of your talk. You're conveying information, they're receiving information. But you want to be audience-centered, not merely focused on your content. One of the big problems that we have in informative speaking and speaking in general is people too focused on their content. They're like, I know what I'm going to say, and they haven't thought about what that audience needs to be getting out of it. So this is the realm of speech goals. So the best way to get at this is to ask of yourself, what do you want the audience to do or to be able to do after listening to your speech? So it's not, so this would be an example. So it's not if you were in sales. I want to sell this product to my audience. That's not the goal. The other way of thinking of that is I want my audience to buy this product. Not I want to sell it to them. That's every cartoon of a used car salesman ever, right? What does it take to put you in this car today? That's just trying to sell it, and it comes across as cheesy and inflexible. If you are, you're having dinner and you got a telemarketer, they're reading the same script. It's just about pushing that content out, and that's why it's sometimes so very frustrating to deal with that. So your goal isn't, in that scenario, isn't to sell the product, it's to get the audience to buy the product. All of a sudden, you got to think about, well, why isn't the audience buying it right now? How can I address their concerns? What do I need to do to overcome that challenge to allow them to buy the product or to encourage them to buy the product? If you were doing a seventh grade class presentation on photosynthesis, it's not, I want to talk about photosynthesis. depending on your level of expertise, you could talk about 1,000 different things relating to photosynthesis. And 999 of them might be totally irrelevant to what the audience needs to hear. So it's not I want to talk about photosynthesis, it's I want my audience to list the steps in photosynthesis. That's a goal. That's thinking about what that audience should be able to do at the end of that presentation. That gives you a lot to work with, being able to think very specifically about what you want them to be able to do with that information. So what are some of the characteristics of these? Well, generally speech goals are audience focused. That's a loud sound that is a deep boring into the wall next door. My goal at this point in time is to not become too distracted by what sounds like someone tunneling into a bank. So speech goals are audience focused. That means you're thinking about what you want the audience to take out of it. Speech goals are concrete. Okay, so you're thinking in very tangible ways about what this audience is going to do. And generally, as you're drafting them, it's a good way to think of speech goals as using active verbs. And I'll show you an example of this here in a moment. Now, if you're in teaching, if you're in education, you might recognize speech goals as kind of similar to some of the writing and talk around learning goals. What do you want your students to be able to do? Kind of like, what do you want your audience to be able to do? And in fact, in many cases, teaching is speaking for a very specific audience, right? You're speaking for that classroom audience. So let me give you an example of some very vague speech goals. So let's say I'm doing a presentation on the history of American presidential debate. So these are vague speech goals. After listening to my speech, the audience should know the history of American presidential debate. Think about some criteria for evaluating debates, be familiar with some of the critiques of the debate format, and have a new perspective on presidential debates. So as goals, it's better to have these than none, but these are pretty vague. I mean, if you look at that first one, know the history of American presidential debate, that's massive. How can I check to see if the audience does that? Or is able to know the entire history? That's so very broad. Think about some criteria for evaluating debates. I don't know if they're thinking or not. So I mean, these are kind of very broadly pitched. Now I could take the same talk and refine them with more precise goals. After listening to my speech, the audience should be able to list some of the key points in the development of American presidential debates. Okay, so there I've got something more specific. I want them to list some key points. So now I don't have to talk about the entire history of it, or I can mention some other things, but my focus is on a couple of key points. And if I'm thinking in terms of time limits, I'm limiting how many key points I can discuss. So if I want my audience to be able to list those key points, that's pretty specific. Let's say I want the audience to be able to explain 2 of the major critiques of the modern American presidential format. I can do that in probably about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. I can have them list a couple of key points in the history, and I can have them explain 2 major critiques of the format. Those are things I can accomplish in 5 to 10 minutes. And that gives me a narrower way of planning that speech, of figuring out what I need to do in the time I have with that audience. As a performative element, these goals are useful because they give you a sense of purpose. Remember in the impromptu we talked about, well, I don't know what I'm doing in each main point, but I want to achieve certain things. I want to make sure that the audience understands what the claim is or understands how the example relates to the claim. That's kind of what we're doing with more detail here in the informative speech. If I want them to explain 2 of the major critiques of the presidential format, that's going to shape how I talk through each one. I'm going to say, here's what the critique is, here's why it emerged, here's what you need to know about it, with the whole idea that at the end of that somebody could explain it. If my goal was they should just be aware of some of the critiques, that would change how I go through that section. All right? If I just want them to be aware of it or that there are critiques, then that's a much different section than if I'm saying I want you to be able to list and explain 2 of the biggest critiques of the presidential debate format. So they give me a sense of purpose in that section. On the planning side, they give you criteria. So if you're running long or you're trying to figure out what to cut from that presentation, those goals are criteria for inclusion-exclusion. If I say that I want them to explain 2 because I think these 2 are particularly important given the topic, then I got to make sure I've got time for both of them. If I don't have time for both of them, I got to decide, do I just want them to know 1 of the major critiques? Or do I just want them to be aware of 3 of the critiques? So these goals, if you've sort of figured out what they are and they're appropriate to that audience and that setting, they give you criteria for making editing decisions, making revision decisions. And so after you've run it a few times, once again, that process of running, revising, reflecting and revising, after you've done that a few times, you can reflect on those goals and change and adapt them as need be. Are you achieving your goals? If you're not, do you need to change the content or do you need to change the goals? So these goals give you a way of thinking strategically through your speech. What does that audience need to hear and understand? So as you are now pulling these all together and you're looking at the goals and you're thinking about your time, your topic, and your audience, be realistic. Concrete goals can really help you understand your time constraints. In 10 minutes, can you truly accomplish, without racing, can you truly accomplish everything that you want to accomplish? Be realistic. It's going to be easier to develop that speech. Either extend your time if possible or cut your goals to fit with your time. So you're trying to find, goals are a good way of sort of mapping out the big themes of the speech. So I'm probably going to, I'm working up this one on Kairos. So I like Kairos. I think it's a good response to this particular audience. It's within my expertise as a rhetorician. Kairos is a rhetorical term, which you'll find out more about later. Kairos is a rhetorical term. It's within my area of expertise. It's probably of interest to this particular online audience, and I can talk about it within 5 to 10 minutes. So I think that hits those rhetorical constraints. Now, as I'm thinking more tangibly about how I'm going to do that in 10 minutes, I start this process of mapping out goals. I might come back and revise these, but these are a good way of sort of starting the planning process. So at the end of my 10-minute presentation, I would love it if viewers of that speech were able to define Kairos. Okay, so that's probably going to be a key chunk. I would like them to be able to distinguish between timing and fittingness. Those are two major components of this concept of Kairos. I would love it if that audience was able to provide a concrete example of Kairos or explain this Ronald Reagan clip that I often talk about in terms of Kairos. So those are 4 pretty concrete goals. They at least help me start to pull together that first draft of the speech. And these are totally open to change, right? As part of the revision process. I don't want to get locked into this stuff if it's not going to work. But this at least allows me to start thinking more concretely about what I want to achieve in the time I have for the audience that I have before me. So what I want you to do now is just very quickly draft up a few speech goals for a speech you're working on. Now, ideally, this would be a speech that you would be working on for this class, an informative speech. But even if not, if you've got a presentation that you got to give next week, think through what are your goals for that speech. What do you really hope and realistically hope that your audience will be able to do at the end of that speech? So go ahead and do that now.